how's it going? How are you, man?
It's great. Good to meet you, Aiden.
Good to meet you as well. I've been a fan of yours for a long time. You used to be in a band called the City Harmonic, and I was a pretty big fan back in my high school days. The first time I saw you live,
not now. Very bored of us now.
No, now I'm done. The first time I saw you live was actually at Youthquake at Briarcrest. And so you guys were there because that's the college I eventually went to. And then I saw you guys again on your last album that you guys kind of did together because they ran a little young adult conference that you guys went to. It was a ton of fun. And I remember the first time I saw you, I didn't know who you guys were at all. And then I went to your concert and was like, dude, they are so good musically. And you've kept doing stuff afterwards. So you guys made 3 full albums together, and now you've been kind of working on your own music, and it's really great. I actually genuinely think you're a super great songwriter. And
thank you.
I think you're not well known enough. It's actually shocking that I feel like you should be a lot bigger than you are. Because I'm like, dude, the music you write, the lyrics you write, I don't understand how it's not even bigger. I've talked to a lot of people like that where I'm like, how is this not? But I don't know. The Christian music world is a confusing world. But for people who don't know,
people have to really like you. And my name is Dummer, so that doesn't really help the whole situation, you know?
No, it might not, but that's okay, you know? For people who don't know who you are, can you just give like an intro to who you are and what you do and what you're up to lately?
Yeah, well, my name is Elias Dummer. I was in a band, like you said, called the City Harmonic, and we had a pretty good run. It was a lot of fun from about 2009 until 2017. So we, in that time, won a Juno and had a couple nominations. We were on the Billboard charts a bunch of times, had radio success in the United States and in Canada, and got to travel the whole world, basically. So it was really fun. Incredible time. Still friends with the guys. Eric and I, now that I've moved back to Hamilton, my main co-writer, Eric, and I still hang out all the time, which has been really great. But I've, in 2017, started making solo records and, some songs. It's funny, like, I feel like now people will hear a song, say, on a playlist or at church, and they don't ever realize who wrote the song. So, songs like Enough or The Gospel is Rest or This is Holy Ground and, that kind of thing. Kyrie eleison, that kind of thing. So it's been, a pretty incredible thing. On the side, which I should say, and I've been doing this for the whole time, actually. I've been involved in business. So I own a marketing agency. I've helped to plant a couple or co-plant a couple of churches. And more recently in the academic space, I have a few businesses in the art space and visual arts. I own an art gallery and a couple of virtual art things, but I've also been participating in this big research project called Worship Leader Research, which has been getting a lot of attention from folks like Christianity Today and Washington Post and that sort of thing. So sort of looking at the intersection of the music industry as it is and the local church. And it's based on like surveys of worship leaders and sort of myth busting, I guess, a little bit about the worship space. So that's been really, really rewarding to sort of have had the experiences I've had, and some of them complicated and some of them beautiful, and then kind of bring them to bear for the benefit of all, I hope. So that's, so there's a few different things in the go.
Can you dive into that? Because I don't really know much about it. Like, what have you, in doing that, been finding, or what are some of the interesting things in doing that research project that have stood out to you that are like, this is really interesting or concerning or exciting?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of worship leaders have a lot of ideas about how songs are made or where songs come from or who's making them, that sort of thing. One of the things that we led with when we first showed our research was an article which ended up kind of everywhere, which was that almost 100%. Now, our research was focused on 2010 through 2020. So in that time, 38 worship songs appeared for the first time on the CCLI and Praise Charts Top 25. So that's a 10-year period, 38 songs. Of those 38, 37 of them, so all but one, were co-written or popularized by a mere 5 mega churches. So essentially the top headline was almost 100% of the top 25 worship songs are associated with a handful of churches. And those churches are pretty much Elevation, Hillsong, Bethel, Passion. And then you've got a song from North Point and a song from Phil Wickham. Now, many of Phil's songs, Phil's a peer, we talk, so it's not like this is an attack on him or anything. Many of Phil's songs were popularized by Bethel. And that's true, say, for All Sons and Daughters, Ren Collective, popularized by Passion in a big way. So there's a lot of different ways that these things play out. And yeah, so that was the first one anyway.
That's really, yeah. I, just to give you an open door into like the dark corners of my life, don't like worship music for the most part. I have a hard time with it. But I get it. When I'm in a service, I like shut off that part of me and is like, but I would never, like, there are some people who really genuinely love the typical worship sound. But for me, I'm like, it all sounds the same. And I think it comes from being younger and being in tons of worship teams that I played so many of the songs that eventually I was like, dude, I can play this in my sleep. But I think it's interesting that it would be written by, and this isn't a knock on people, it's just personal preference, where people listen to the music I like and be like, this is garbage, and that's totally fine.
Sure.
But it's interesting that most of our music is written by a handful of churches, mega churches. Why is that? Why is it? Because it's not like there's a lack of artists making music that could be sung in church.
Sure.
So why is it?
It's a super complicated question. And it's actually one that speaks directly to what happened with the City Harmonic. So we had a big song called Manifesto at first. That was our first big hit. And it was played at Passion. It was the theme song. Oh, yeah. It was a theme song for the National Day of Prayer. It was number one on Air One. And I think it was top 5 on K-Love. Like, it was everywhere. Canada didn't care much for it. But
I cared about it, so
no, but Canada has this funny self-loathing thing.
Yes, where it's like,
they don't like a Canadian band that's until the US. One of 3 things has to happen. 1, the USA says you're great. Then Canada's like, they were ours all along. The UK has to say you're great. Then Canada's like, yeah. Or you burn all of your money for 10 years touring Canada coast to coast. And then in the 11th year, Canada turns around and says, you're great. And so you got bands like Tragically Hip or Arkells or all these other bands that are, Canadian heroes that had to crisscross Canada forever, breaking their back before Canada embraced them. So we have this weird kind of who do you think you are thing going on here, right? So Manifesto was the victim to that. It really never took up here, but every song we did afterwards did in Canada. Well, the problem with Manifesto was that it didn't sound like worship music. It sounded like a piano rock band that happened to write a worship song, which is what City Harmonic was doing the whole time. Now, the reason that doesn't translate to CCLI success, so CCLI is the body that tracks and organizes royalties for songs used in church, right? So it's a good sense of what's happening in mostly evangelical churches. Well, the reason that didn't work is that people couldn't play Manifesto alongside the other music that was already there and take for granted that it wouldn't feel jarring or out of place. Now, if you think about that, that's true of every genre. This is not a problem unique to worship music. Metal from one band to the next has very minimal difference. Look at 2010's emo, for goodness sake. Very little difference from band to band. Like practically none. The only genre that has any real breadth to it would be, say, something like hip hop, where it's kind of broken off into subgenres now. I mean, everybody's got subgenres, but pop music has pretty good variability because you've got almost everything collected into it. But at the end of the day, as soon as you're in a genre, that genre doesn't have a whole lot of variability. And so worship music is no different. Now, we can argue whether worship music should be a genre or not, and that's fine. But it is one because it serves a purpose, just like European techno serves a purpose. If you go to a German club, you want the 808. If you don't get the 808, it's not going to work, right? So it's for a purpose. It's doing a function, right? And so the question really then becomes like, okay, so we've got well-known worship teams have been putting out records, and this is changing already, but at least between 2010 and 2020, are putting out records that smaller to medium-sized or ambitious large churches are then taking on their music. So the question we've kind of been teasing at or trying to figure out how to figure out, I don't know if we have, is like, what's the role of aspiration and ambition in that? To what extent are local worship leaders picking songs because they love them or because they're familiar versus possibly the more subconscious component, which is like, I want to be like that. I mean, Seth Godin, I've run a marketing agency 16 years, I mentioned. Like, Seth Godin is this popular marketer, and he sort of says a lot of human choice making comes down to this one sentence: people like us do things like this. And so if you want to figure out what's going on in any given market, sure, there might be, nefarious players doing things, but most of the time, marketing and business is reactive, not proactive. And so the people who are really in the power seat when it comes to what happens at a church on a Sunday are overworked, busy worship pastors in local churches. So if you have to figure out why are they all picking the same songs, well, you have to ask them. So that's what we did.
And so what were some of the reasons or like the things you found that they would give?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because this is ultimately like a survey project, right? And in marketing, you look at surveys with a bit of a scance, because surveys are one of those things where people tell you what they think they think. And so part of what you need to do is measure what they say they're doing and the reasons they're doing against what their actual behaviors are. And so we'd originally designed our experiment to show that. So we had hoped to get a bunch of planning center data, for example, and to measure dates and that sort of thing. But there just weren't enough churches who had data that spread over that entire period. So we couldn't use that part of the research. And so we ended up focusing on the survey data itself. So, I mean, worship leaders say a whole bunch of reasons. But one thing that we measured quite a bit was trust, for example. So we sort of said, hey, what is the likelihood of you to pick a song based on who the artist is? And of course, worship leaders would report, well, no, the majority would say, no, the artist isn't that important to me. And then the next question was a list of artists and then them rating the likelihood. And it's amazing to me that, and we all do this because you're clicking the thing, but it's amazing to me that the very next question was an example of the thing they just said they don't do, and they did it. So like I think part of it is like the recognition. And, the reality is we have a lot of ways in which we've used spiritual language to dress up very human enterprise. And that doesn't mean that God isn't in it. That doesn't mean that God can't use it. But I think we, particularly in evangelicalism, need a wake-up call to just how real and human so much of what we do is. And that God uses those things. He always has. In fact, that's like theology 101 that most of us miss, is God has been working through human agency for the whole of Scripture and beyond, And so we try to dress things up in spiritual language to avoid that fact. But the reality is, at the end of the day, we have these songs, we have a grouping of songs that are very, very popular. And one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, is that humans behave the same way here that they do everywhere else. They show favoritism to popularity, to things which are already popular. They want to minimize work. There's a bunch of different reasons, and folks will name theology and that sort of thing as part of their considerations. But at the end of the day, it almost always plays out.
Does that concern you at all? Or do you look at that data and you're just like, well, it could be bad, but it's not necessarily bad. Like when you look at that as someone who's doing this and as someone who's in the worship music kind of sphere and circles, does what you're studying concern you at all? Or is it more just, these are just facts? They're not
these
really
are just facts.
Good or bad.
Yeah, no, I really don't think they're good or bad. I think we can really, in fact, I think it's healthier for us to name these facts than it is for us to allow the status quo to spiritualize commercial success. Because the moment that we assume that a song which reached everyone was blessed by the Holy Spirit to reach everyone, we take all kinds of things for granted and we baptize the tactics that got it there. We don't want to do that. And so even folks who would like openly criticize, say, prosperity gospel, and I'm among them, right? When saying this isn't a representation of the New Testament story at all, right? I'd be one of those people. Even among us, there's some tendency to want to believe that God endowed our song with hit success. You know, they use words like anointed and all sorts of stuff. And so I think we're seeing in the ways that we subconsciously think about worship music, some of the same biases that play out in all kinds of ways within evangelicalism. And so I'm not trying to tear anything down or tear anybody down. I just think, and my team, which are a group of really respected academics, I just think it's important that we really name the facts as they are, and talk about them that way, because otherwise it's a recipe for serious deconstruction for people who get one bit of information without context, or one bit of information without context. And I'm a big believer in the process of, you know, myth busting, because if we rely on particular, especially as a marketing guy, you know, if your story relies on misleading language, or it relies entirely on a lie or some omission, what does that say about what's really going on about the thing, right?
What do you mean? Because you just said a sentence. It's interesting of like people can take a sentence out of context or without knowing the whole picture, and then this kind of stuff can lead to deconstruction. Because in my brain, I'm like, how would this lead to some form of what would they be deconstructing?
Well, the idea, for example, at minimum, it has the power and potential to erode trust in the church and in the churches that we're part of. So if you grew up in an evangelical church singing these songs, and you see that some people have made money, and you don't have a context through which it happens, you don't even a sense in which, hey, no, there's good, faithful people who are doing these things, and yes, there's a bunch of money floating around. Then it's very easy to say, oh, Hillsong made $1 million. Well, that doesn't go that far when you actually break it down. But nevertheless, they could take one fact and run with it all the way to, oh my gosh, everything in this circle is about money. Everything in this circle is about taking advantage of people and that sort of thing. And there are maybe moments in which that's true, or people in which that's true, but you certainly can't paint with a large brush at that point, you know?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Because I have heard that, especially about the larger churches like Hillsong and Bethel. It's pretty much like they just do this for money, which I think is like maybe some people do. But I'm like,
well, you can't divorce it from money.
No, it's not like they're not making money, but it's also not. Yeah, because I've heard people argue that, and that the worship music industry is only solely about money.
Yeah, and that's just simply not true, because there are tons of money. There's tons of complexity to it. There's tons of, hey, should we be doing it this way and why? But it's a misattribution of the problem for us to point it at as if there's some cabal of church worship leaders who are controlling what local worship leaders do. It's not how it works.
What? Yeah, that's interesting. So, and it's interesting because I've seen it on both people who deconstruct into more like what would be, in quotation marks, a progressive camp and the conservative camp of like, I've seen conservative videos that are kind of like mustache twirling, being like, let me tell you the secrets of Bethel. Right. And they're doing this all for money. And it's like,
the irony of those camps is their love of hymnody.
So what do you mean?
The irony of contemporary worship is that it is actually more just to the creator than, and I don't mean creator as in Jesus, I mean creator as in the songwriter. It is more just to the songwriter now than it ever has been. So the difference between contemporary worship as a business model and hymns as a business model is the monetization of music. There's no difference in intent. In fact, it's more open-handed than it was. Like if you look at how hymns worked, it was at a time where music was monetized through the sale of paper products. So people would take a bunch of hymns, package them as notation, and then sell them in the streets to churches. And they would sell them in great quantities to churches, right? Now, because of the nature of that business, it was never a super profitable business. But make no mistake about it, it was an attempt at a for-profit enterprise. These were not charitable goods. There was hymn salesmen, there was publishing companies. And what didn't happen is the money from those sales making their way to Fanny Crosby. That didn't happen. But the people along the way were absolutely creatures of their time.
Why do you think we just write off, like, I don't know. It feels like people don't even think about that. Even the fact that there are hymnals being purchased, someone's making money by all the hymnals being bought. Why do you think that doesn't cross people's mind when they think about, we should just go back to hymns, and wasn't it better when people weren't making bucket loads of money on worship music? Why does that happen?
Yeah, I actually don't know. I mean, there's a whole bunch of historical bias, I think, within evangelical circles, and Christian people in general do this. You know, we take for granted that history must have been radically different and humans weren't humans until I was born. You know, I mean, that's kind of a tendency we all have. And it's certainly true in evangelicalism. Like, take eschatology, for example, right? Most debates within evangelicalism are debates between an option A and an option B interpretation of eschatology, both of which are less than 250 years old. So we're not talking about a historically rooted debate. We're talking about we're projecting our worldview back onto the past so often. And so when the reality is, you see throughout all of church history, and this is sort of what I was saying at the beginning, God working through human agency, human enterprise, human culture, specific times and places. Like, there is a sense in which the gospel is an incarnational gospel, and we so badly want it to be an escapist gospel. And I think that just is part of the problem in worship music, in Christian ministry in general, is that, like, oh, we want spiritual things to be completely unlike the real lives that we lead, instead of having our real lives saturated with the ways of the kingdom through it. And it's a lot more complicated when you go there.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I am doing an interview, unless something falls through, with Mark Foreman, who's John Foreman's dad.
Yeah.
And he talks about that. He wrote a book a long time ago called Holy Jesus, and it's where John Foreman got a lot of the things he talked about, where you would hear some of the language of, because he would be like a Switchfoot, like, we're not a Christian band, we're just a band who is full of Christians, and it would drive him nuts. And part of the reason why in Mark Foreman's book he talks about is that Christianity in the West, especially in the last few years, has wanted to, like, escape the world and find, like, a little safe haven where it's like, this is the spiritual place.
Yeah, I'd call it cultural separatism. Yeah.
And so and I've seen that even in my own life. Like, there's part of me that desires that, of like, oh, this is like the safe haven of, this is where the spiritual things are, and I don't want it to be the same as when I go into the rest of the world, which is really interesting because it's like the opposite of what Scripture calls us to. Which is kind of his point, where it's like, we're actually supposed to go into the world and be a light. And so we're like, let's retreat and just, like, be a bunch of lights huddled away in a corner together off in the distance. And so
yeah, exactly. Which is complicated because we want a simple moral compass. And I don't know that one exists when you're engaging in the world, because the world is a complicated and a lot of the time a broken place. And so you can't engage the world without engaging in broken systems. You can't engage the world without engaging with broken people, and without being one. So there's a sense in which, like, our complexity is there, and we will do anything to ostrich and avoid it, right? And so, with our worship leader research stuff, I honestly think that it very often comes down to, undoing those myths. And I think it's God's work, because the more naturally we talk about these things, and that's true of worship leading too. I mean, being in marketing for as long as I have a sort of a hobby interest in neuroscience, and, looking at, say, the effects of group singing chemically, and what's going on in the brain when we sing, and the question of emotional manipulation in worship and that sort of thing, I think are vital. Because if we don't look at them in a clear-eyed way, then just the same as with worship stuff, we're just setting people up for disappointment and disaster. And I think it's pastoral work to protect people from disaster.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, all of that's really helpful. I didn't plan to talk about any of that. So
hey, that's great.
But it's really great, really interesting. I want to dive more into it later myself. And so, yeah, thanks for doing that work. Yeah. I didn't bring you on here to talk about that, but I'm really glad we did because I think it's super awesome. But I wanted to talk to you about your latest album because you make music and you make great music.
Thank you.
And you released an album a little bit ago, The Work Volume 2, kind of doing your own solo stuff. And honestly, it's really great. And I just wanted to break down, while I have your time and honor your time, just some of the songs and to be able to show people some of it because I think it's really great and people would like it. You kick off the album with a song Expectation, which is a song I've heard a million times because my wife loves it. And like for a long period of time it was on repeat. And I think it's a really great song. And it really dives into the theme of us being able as followers of Jesus to have an expectation that God is actually moving in some way. And so for you in writing that song and making that song, what inspired that song for you? What was kind of the message you were hoping to get across or sing about or write about?
Yeah. Well, the funny thing about songwriting is sometimes you write because you have this deeply personal story and you need to, get it on page or you'll die, something like that. And sometimes you write a song because you need a kind of a song. You're like, I need this thing to exist. Expectation was more the second than the first for me, although there's plenty of my story in it. It was really a call to worship. And part of what we were wrestling with, I wrote it with Ben Cantillon, who I wrote A City on a Hill with years and years ago, and he's a good friend. Part of what we were talking about was just that like so much of our worship music just doesn't feel honest in a way. It feels celebratory in a way that people don't always feel. It seems to lack human nuance. And so part of what we were trying to do in Expectation was really call people from wherever they are. So whether they're young or whether they are, an adult or whether they are wrestling with doubt in a very real way. And to say that, look, it's not like God doesn't want you here doing this thing together, and you, wherever you are at, can bring that knowing that God is with us. That God is in our midst in a sense. So that's really what that song is about. As worship songs tend to do. I mean, it's filled with bold promises in a sense. But it is ultimately the verse which stands out to me personally. And as a person, you may not know this, but the City Harmonic was like one of the, OG deconstruction bands. And by that, I mean, like by the time the City Harmonic was a band, we had already all been through enough seminary reading and that sort of thing that the ideas that we'd had about Christianity in high school were dead. We were already in a different place, which meant that we were like foreigners the whole time we were touring because so much of Christian culture is that thing. But we were faithful, sincere, all that, but coming at it from a different angle than a lot of people do a lot of the time. And so Expectation, the verse which stands out to me is that third verse that come with faith by a thread, bring doubt and hurt and the questions echo in your head because God can take it. I think partly as a challenge to believers who are in that place and partly as a challenge to churches to become that sort of place.
Come with faith like a child, bring trust and wonder and hands lifted higher and higher, 'cause he'll carry you home. Come with faith like the young, bring dreams and vision in a heart that burns with desire to see the kingdom come. It burns with desire to see the kingdom come. Expectation, our God is here with us. Holy Spirit, meet us as we are. Waking us your holy fire. All we want is all you are. Here in expectation. Expectation, our God is here with us. Holy Spirit, meet us as we are. Waking us your holy fire. All we want is all you are. Here in expectation. Expectation, our God is here with us. Holy Spirit, meet us as we are. Waking us your holy fire. All we want is all you are. Here in expectation. Expectation, our God is here with us. Holy Spirit, meet us as we are. Waking us your holy fire. All we want is all you are. Here in expectation. Expectation, our God is here with us. Holy Spirit, meet us as we are. Waking us your holy fire. All we want is all you are. Here in expectation. Expectation, our God is here with us. Holy Spirit, meet us as we are. Waking us your holy fire. All we want is all you are. Here in expectation. Expectation, our God is here with us. Holy Spirit, meet us as we are. Waking us your holy fire. All we want is all you are. Here in expectation. Expectation, our God is here with us. Holy Spirit, meet us as we are. Waking us your holy fire. All we want is all you are. Here in expectation. Expectation, our God is here
was that like for you? So if you're on tour, I think that's why your music lyrically has constantly hit for me, even when I would have been in the circles that you wouldn't have felt like you agreed with as much, is because I think there's a lot of depth there and there's a lot of honesty. And so for you guys, when you were on tour, going into those circles of like being in places where you're like, I don't know how I feel about this, or if we agree, what was that like? Like, how did you kind of put that aside? I think it's
exactly like pastoring.
What do you mean?
Well, your average person who goes to church has a life to live. You don't want to take for granted that somebody needs to have 8 years of schooling to start thinking of themselves in Christian ways. And so obviously there's habits and practices and ideas and all these things which form us and shape us and help us to go from A to B and that sort of thing. And so I think it was a lot like that, honestly. We were learning and growing, figuring out what worked, what meant something to people and that sort of thing, and trying our best to tell the story of unity that had been real to us in our city. But it was just, being faithful. I think so much of Christian living is simple faithfulness and patience. And we want neither of those things. We want to control outcomes. Neither of those things. Yeah, we want efficiency. We want number ones. We want outcomes. Churches want to say they saved X people from anyway. But there's all sorts of stuff like that. And at the end of the day, so much of what we're called to is to be good storytellers and story embodiers. And so I think a lot of it was like that. There were instances where they'd have a certain kind of altar call or something, and we would just pray the way we needed to pray, to offer a salve to people who were like, what just happened? Or in some cases we would do a show and then something would happen. I won't name names, but we would do a big event, really, really big event attached to a big name person. And they would have someone on the platform who would just spew hateful stuff and I'm like racist stuff. And so we would just, at that point, we'd call our agent and say, I don't care how much they offer us, we can't do these events. And so we wouldn't do those. but there's lines you draw, which are like, basic human lines. Mm-hmm. And then there's lines you draw, which are like, hey, there's going to be a difference in theology. We were an ecumenical band. That was our story. So our songs which came out were the fruit of guys from different traditions, not broadly speaking in that we were all Protestant, but guys from different theological traditions, at least within Protestantism, trying to come to terms with what we could say together. And so that was constantly the back and forth of the City Harmonic. And so we'd be hard pressed to be out in the world separating over theological distinctives as a band which had theological distinctives baked into us,
Yeah. That's really cool. Another song with a lyric that I find really interesting is that they sing. And in it, you talk about how people who sing are like praying twice, which I think is really interesting. I've never even seen that written in like a song.
Really?
I don't think so. It doesn't come to my brain. But I don't think the interesting thing is when I ask people, I don't find that often. A lot of people ask why we do things in church. We just do them because we've done them. And one of the things, especially, is worship music, where it's like, why do we do this? Like when you think about it, it's weird. It's like Christian karaoke. We're all together singing songs that got 4 chords. And it's like, what is happening? And a lot of people haven't asked that. And one of the big things for me that I've been like, guys, this is us like praying together in a way that's different. But can you dive into that and like that theme in that song? And
so I don't know who the original quote is from, but it's often misattributed to Augustine, which is he that sings praise twice. It's on posters all over the place with that, but from what I can tell, Augustine didn't actually say it. But it is a quote that means a lot to me, and particularly as I've dived into sort of the neuroscience stuff. I think one of the things that we glaze over is that when asked how to live a kingdom eternal life, Jesus answers with the Shema. Love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, which is the second verse of They That Sing, if I'm not mistaken. It was a minute since I wrote that song, but I think so. And then love your neighbor as yourself. right? And Jesus uses this bridge phrase, which is, and the second is like it. So in other words, do these things to God and we'll know you're doing them if you love your neighbor very well, right? So there's a sense in which Jesus' answer is very holistic. It's saying love God with your soul, yes, but also with your emotions, also with your body, also with your whole self. And in fact, in Hebrew, it's likely love the God with your all, and all. Right? So there's a sense in which singing has a unique property to the human body that we can over spiritualize and we can also under spiritualize. So in other words, group singing has been shown to produce both dopamine, which is a reward chemical, and anyone with ADHD knows plenty well what dopamine is, but dopamine and then also oxytocin. So oxytocin is often referred to as the love hormone. So this is what happens on your first date when you touch elbows at the movie theater, or, a mom who's holding her baby and breastfeeding for the first time is flooded with oxytocin, right? As this is it deepens social bonds. Well, group singing produces huge amounts of oxytocin in the human brain. And in fact, group singing, when you add in synchronous movement, produces much, much more. So oxytocin deepens our trust bonds. People will leave liking each other more, remembering more facts about one another, all of that sort of thing. But then on top of it, one of the byproducts in a small way is altruism. So people literally leave group singing with a sense of wanting to better the world at their expense. So in a subtle way, it's not to say that everyone who sings together is more like Jesus. It's not that simple. But the practices of worship which we do, such as group prayer through song, right, are in a way embodying that Matthew 22 directive of Jesus. Love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Group singing does that physiologically for humans.
They that sing, oh, it's like the praying twice, and so we bring a song of love for God. They that sing, oh, it's like the praying twice, and so we bring a song of love for God. If we come broken, we pray. From the wreckage, make a melody. Sing, holy is the Lord, heart and soul. Sing it, holy, holy at the top of our lungs. Sing it, holy is the Lord, holy is the Lord.
That's so weird. And the cynical, I can hear the cynic being like, see, worship and all this stuff is just emotional manipulation and it's all just a
Sure,
bunch of
yeah,
emotions.
they could say that.
But then the part of me that's not cynical is like, or it's cool to look at it and be like, I think God actually designed us for worship. That like the reason why these things are happening is because this might be actually just part of our design, that our brains work this way because this is actually how we were made to work.
Well,
which is
and
really
it's back to
cool.
that thing I was saying earlier. We're like, do we have to assume that everything which God is doing has to be done despite the world as it is?
Yeah.
Or can we take for granted that God would work through the world in some meaningful way? And I definitely fall in the camp of the latter. And so science doesn't scare me at all.
Yeah. Yeah, man, that's so interesting. Even in thinking about concerts, because I've thought before for non-Christians of like, it almost seems like a religious experience where even people will like raise their hands, and it's like, why is that happening? And to look at them and be like, oh, okay, that I can see this. This makes actual sense.
Yeah, totally. Which then begs the question: the problem doesn't become, does it feel good to sing together? Of course it does. Is there a byproduct of singing together? Of course there is. The problem becomes, what do we do then? So it's more of a language question. In other words, we as worship leaders, as pastors, as leaders, ought to be real careful not to tell everybody that when they have goosebumps, that's proof of the Holy Spirit. Because it doesn't mean that at all.
Mm-hmm.
They could have that same feeling at, Taylor Swift.
At Nickelback.
Right? For goodness sake. Like that, goosebumps doesn't mean God is blessing this thing. Goosebumps means you're having an experience that we call collective effervescence. You're having this heightened reality experience, a transcendent experience, which is shared by every world religion, major group events, many of which are horribly dark. So we don't want to take for granted that just because it feels good means it is good, but nor should we take for granted that just because we can measure it means it's not godly.
I want to talk about how many songs does it take to change the world. This song is really cool. I love the second verse. Actually, I don't know if I love it. I was convicted in reading the lyrics and listening along to it and being like, because you essentially talk about like God doesn't really, like we're all here sipping coffee, doing an offering and being like, how do we get more power? And that's not what we're called to do. It's a really interesting song. For you and for those who don't know the song, can you dive into the themes that are kind of in there and some of the things that you were trying to like poke at or even feel a conviction over for yourself possibly?
So how many songs does it take to save the world was probably more confessory than anything. Or really a realization to a degree that we like there's this C.S. Lewis quote, I think it's from Screw Tape Letters, talking about the challenge of the artist or the pastor or the poet who begins writing their art, their craft out of love for the creator or love for the story of the creator. And then eventually is so lost in hell because they've just fallen in love with the craft itself and their telling of it. I just destroyed that quote, but that's the general idea. And so I think the thing is, this song speaks to a lot of things I wrestle with a lot of the time, which is like, hey, look, my new song isn't going to save the world. It's another attempt at turning over the diamond and seeing maybe a unique sparkle. It's the same story. It's the same song. And so on some level, putting songs out which try to tell that story in a new way to a new person is a good enterprise to be a part of, but in church, it's a different story. Like, we are a community of people who've come together on the premise that we've given our whole lives over to this Lord Jesus. But the best that we do is functionally a lawn bowling club with, minimal perks. And so I think at the end of the day, we really need to make sure. Actually, the thing that stands out to me is that third verse, which we've been singing about since early City Harmonic. If I sing a new song, it had better ring out with justice, not just for its own sake, with tired lines and old borrowed phrases. Yours is the kingdom, don't need market share. You'd kick over tables in this house of prayer. Tell me, how many songs does it take to save the world? So I'm not saying, just to be clear, that Jesus hates commerce, because I don't think you could really conclude that. He relied on commerce. I mean, his ministry was funded by women who were often owned vineyards and other things who were funding the early ministry of Jesus. So instead, I think it's, what are we playing at? Not are we using mechanisms that, are like the world? That's not really, you'd be hard pressed not to. The question is, what are we ultimately doing? Are we seeking to better our communities? Are we seeking justice in our communities? Are we seeking that our neighbors' lives are better? I mean, I think of the nation of Israel in exile, in Babylonian exile. And what they were told to do was to plant gardens and marry off your daughters to Babylonians, and not in a bad way, but in a good way. In other words, do things which are good for Babylon, and they'll be good for you. And the reality is, the church is a land in exile. We live in, and by our own making, we live in societies which are not fundamentalist, top-down, angry Christian societies. We can have ideas about what they are, but they're not that. And so whatever they are, we don't control the behaviors of other people. And so the question is, what then do we do as the church? So this song is about that. It's saying, look, writing another hit song isn't going to make justice unless we go out and try to do our best to live justly.
If I sing a new song, it had better be one I'm living, not just Sunday morning. Cup of coffee, high notes, and giving. You honest, faithful. We bargain for power. You want the whole thing. I offered an hour. Tell me, how many songs does it take to save the world? 'Cause if there's one song, well, I'm gonna sing it. Don't care about hit songs. Preach to the choir. Wake up, you giant. Quit lullabying. Tell me, how many songs does it take to save the world?
That's really profound. And I think, yeah, convicting. I probably like the lyric because it hits me in a way of that, oh, okay. To skip around, another song I really love is The Gospel is Rest. In it, towards the end, you say something where I was like, you say, maybe I'm addicted to the worry. Maybe I'm addicted to holding on, which I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Because even I'm a pastor. So I found with people in business, but even within myself, of like, there's this weird part of me that is addicted to worry that I don't fully get, where to be amped up about, I don't know, the news or whatever is stressing you out is something that, weirdly enough, part of you enjoys to some degree. And it's weird to not do that. And so for you, in writing this song, The Gospel is Rest, it also brings me like a bunch of John Mark Comer quotes and Ruthless Elimination of Hurry and stuff, where that's where my brain goes. What were you trying to come across in this song, and specifically with the addiction to worry piece? How have you found that in maybe your own life or in other people's lives?
Oh gosh, for us? Yeah. So I mentioned I wrote this song. I mentioned earlier that I run a few companies. So I'm an entrepreneur. I've been in ministry. I'm still in ministry through what I'm doing, although not in a not-for-profit way, as in I make money on my music. So I run 6 companies. Like the reality is I have a life that could be catnip to a workaholic. And so in 2016, I started out into a year of anxiety-induced vertigo. So I was playing a show in Newfoundland, of all places, and had a weird negotiation by email during the afternoon with one of my business things, and just went out on stage having had too much coffee, not enough sleep, too much stress. And I had no alcohol, but I was functionally drunk on stage. I was dizzy as all get out, couldn't pull myself together. And then the band, normally I would help tear down and stuff like that after the show. And Steve Lensink, one of our band guys and tour manager at the time, was like, I think you need to get back to the hotel right away. So I went to the hotel and I was sick all night, and then had to fly home on myself the day after back to Nashville, and was dizzy in the airport on the plane. It was terrible. And while it wasn't as bad as that, a faint sense of that was there for about a year. And so at first they thought I had Meniere's disease, which would lead to hearing loss and dizziness for your life, and is manageable. But, so they had me off of salts and all kinds of stuff. Turns out it was just a prolonged anxiety attack. So I had functionally, as the band was getting prepared to retire, I was building a company. I had just co-planted a church. I was experiencing probably something like burnout. And so about a year later, it went away. A couple of years later than that, finally started to go, oh, I didn't have Meniere's disease. Maybe I just had severe anxiety. And that's what was going on. And it was from all the things I was doing, not just as if doing many things means you have an anxiety problem, but rather how you do them and what you do in them and what your attitude is towards them can play a major role. And so the Gospel is Rest I wrote with some friends at a writing retreat, which several songs actually came out of that weekend. Carrie is another one that came out of that weekend. Gospel is Rest. Man, it's just so easy to think that the church lives or dies on your back. It doesn't. It doesn't at all. Like, not even a little bit. And so I think that it's real easy to think that, oh, if I don't do this thing today, my whole company folds. And you know what? Sometimes there's a shred of truth to it. But if you haven't created a company that doesn't need you for 4 hours, you're not a very good entrepreneur. If you haven't led a congregation of people who don't need you for 2 Sundays, you're not a very good pastor. So like, or at least you're not a very good leader in terms of organizing people and helping them feel some sense of confidence for each other. And it just dawned on me how much that sense of control, that sense of worry is ultimately a selfish habit for me. It's ultimately about wanting to be Atlas. And so that's what that song is. It's saying, you know, I've been told that the gospel of Jesus is a gospel of peace, of rest, peace that passes understanding. And I've allowed myself to experience so little of that. So I'm just going to keep singing this song over and over and over again until it sinks in enough that I'm more and more. And I'm still a work in progress in a big way, but I will say that my anxiety is different than it once was.
Lord, I got the world upon my shoulders, but you've been saying, child, put it down. I prayed and prayed that you would take my burden, but you keep saying, child, put it down. Maybe I'm addicted to the worry. Maybe I'm a slave to holding on. Help me put it down. Help me put it down. I've heard it said the gospel is rest. Oh, how I need it. Say it again till I believe it. Oh, how I need it. Oh, how I need it.
And I feel like that's something a lot of people are feeling a wrestling of, where it's something that's being talked about quite a bit in the church, but I think it's because it's something a lot of us struggle with. And we live in a Western world that for a long time was like, push yourself to the max. And that's what living the good life is. And we've now been like, I don't know if it is actually.
Yeah, exactly.
And for us being able to find that rest is in Jesus. So, yeah.
Oh, totally. Well, and I think in the church, we often uncritically take on the faint musing of a business idea without really doing it very well, or even doing it in the way that businesses tend to. But it's in a book once and we read it. So now we're going to do this to grow the kingdom. It's like, wait a minute, that's not how that works. And so I see this in marketing all the time with churches. And I don't really usually work with churches. I work in the business world, but you see it and people take a vague idea and do a horrible job of it and call it business. And then they're just exhausted at the end. But it's not on us to save the world. That's what Jesus did and is doing. It's on us to just be faithful storytellers to the best of our ability. And, not to have no urgency or anything like that, but it's very, very different. You don't see in the early church, you don't see in the Gospels, you don't see in Acts, these sort of binary proclamations, which are, you see faithfulness. You see people talk in the writings of historians around the early church and early Rome. You see people saying, well, why are they doing such a good job of taking care of people? You see a sense of that faithfulness to the way of Christ in a big way that I think doesn't give us a whole lot of job security as pastors, because you can't say I grew the church 18% last year when you're encouraging people to do faithfulness, because you might lose the church 40% in the process. but at the end of the day, it is the call of the gospel.
Yeah. Oh, that's huge. To honor your time, I just want to end it with where your album kind of ends. So long story short, it's almost, in reading the lyrics and looking at the songs that start the album and end the album, they kind of end and begin in the same place, where this song kind of is a similar thing to Expectation, in the sense of like, our story short is about God, and that God's a God we can trust. And I love the way you end the album with like this huge moment of like, holy is the Lord Almighty. And I think it's really powerful and profound. What made you want to write this song? And did you see that there's a connection between the two? Was that intentional? Or was that just
no, this is very much a concept album. I didn't really talk about it too much, but I mean, this album came out in 2022. So a lot of it was written in the wake of what happened in the church in 2020.
Yeah.
And so I knew this was going to be a bittersweet album. I knew that I couldn't write an album of peppy worship songs. Because I had frankly too much frustration.
Yeah.
So much of this album is wrestling with, what do you do with disappointment and frustration? What do you do with the church as it is? And what do you do with God in light of the church and all of that? And so Expectation through Long Story Short is really that. In fact, Carrie, the flow of Carrie with the Bible verse being read by the little kid into Long Story Short, I think is how it goes, right? That's sort of intended to sort of bring, like, we've been through this journey of frustration and pain and hurt. And look, I have, as much as many people do, been very hurt by people in the church, deeply. But at the end of the day, I've seen God to be faithful. And so there's a sense of like participation in the life of the church that is life-giving. And there's a sense in which it's just not easy. It's a community, and community is hard. And so Long Story Short is really an attempt to see and show how God, through all of Scripture, is really what it's doing, paints a picture of God working in surprising ways through people throughout all of history, and pointing to God being true to every word, even if we don't know when or why.
Up in the air, face to face, with everything in its right place. This risen body wide awake, for people from the grave set free. Feet that sing of joy and peace. What else could we possibly need but now to finally see that our long story short is you are true to your every word. You're true to your every word. You're true to your every word. You're true to every word.
Man, it's got to be weird to write songs that I've had a few friends write books now, and to see when they start writing it to when it releases, is you're like, hopefully the things I was writing about 2 years ago are still resonant with people, or it's got to be somewhat weird.
It is.
I think, I find the album really great. And
thank you
for doing this and for all the research you're doing and all those different things. It's interesting to talk to you because I'm like, man, I would love to keep talking. And if it wasn't for you needing to go on with life, I'm like, there's so many things I would love to dive into deeper with you, because I'm actually like, man, you have a lot of like pretty profound thoughts and have been thinking about things pretty deeply. And so,
well, thank you.
Thanks for doing this, man. Really enjoy having you on. For those who want to support you in the work you do, whether it's with the different studies or even musically, can you just tell them what they can do or where they can go?
Absolutely. Yeah. Best place to find me is eliasdummer.com, or on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, Facebook. Elias Dummer. There aren't other people trying to take that name very often, thankfully. You can also go to worshipleaderresearch.com if you're curious about all the stuff that we've done there. I'm now touring again, which is fun. I haven't done that in a couple of years, really. So it's been fun to get out and play shows, and we're playing City Harmonic songs, we're playing original songs. So if you're in a church in Canada or the United States and you've been ever playing our music in your church and you'd love to have me there, you can go to eliasdummer.com. There's a form there you can fill out too. We'd love to visit. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Elias. This has been great. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.